Nodding. We've all done it in a church, a board meeting, a lecture, a conference, in a car while someone is talking, in school on all levels. I have nodded while praying and while others are praying. But my favorite nodding story is one of my dear friends in Michigan. While he was at university, his friend always slept in one of their biggest theology classes, so he decided to play a trick right in the middle of the lecture. He said, Dr. So-and-so wants you to close in prayer. And he was really lecturing at that point. In the middle of the lecture, he stood up to thank God for the class, and the professor stopped. The students all bowed their heads instead of listening, and class was immediately over when he said, Amen, nodding. What is embarrassing is that Luke records this story for every generation to read across the world and across history here in Acts chapter 20 for our 260 journey. Can you imagine people reading your nodding story? This is the only time you're mentioned in the Bible, and this is the story you get. I may register a complaint if that's my only story, but then again, I'm thankful it's here. Why do people fall asleep in church? Just think about this. Chuck Swindoll said it like this. He said there are 5 reasons people sleep in church. 1, tradition. When we were youngsters and had pews, we associated sermons with our mom's lap and we were allowed to sleep on them. He also said there's physical factors. The church is stuffy, poorly lit, hot, not ventilated. Personal factors. Occasionally we don't get enough sleep or we're on some medication. He says, fourthly, indifference, our lack of interest in spiritual things that we can get preoccupied and we start texting folks. Or 5, a boring preacher, poorly organized, rambling, unpassionate, not really saying anything. It happens, and it happens too much in our pulpits. George Whitefield, the great 18th century preacher, said it like this: to preach more than a half an hour, a man should be an angel himself or have angels for hearers. Well, our story has a nodder and someone who preached really long. Here it is, Acts 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day. And he prolonged his message until midnight. It means he preached long. There were many lamps in the upper room when we were gathered together. And there was a young man named Eutychus sitting on the windowsill, sinking into a deep sleep as Paul kept on talking. He was overcome by sleep, fell down from the 3rd floor, and was picked up for dead. But Paul went down, fell upon him, and after embracing him, he said, do not be troubled, for his life is still in him. When he had gone back up and they broke bread and began to eat, he talked with them a long time until daybreak and then left. They took away the boy alive and were greatly comforted. I love that nodding story that's in the Bible. Do you know that many of the Puritan preachers of the past would preach for 2 and 3 hours, and they actually had someone walking around during their sermon with a giant pole, fishing pole, like with a string and a wooden ball on the end of it to hit people on the head who were nodding in church? Can you imagine that being a ministry in your church? For some reason, I think people would sign up a lot for that, but for the wrong reasons. This is really important that we have a glimpse, not a model, of what a New Testament church is, what the early church service first looked like. It was the first day of the week, the breaking of bread, but you did have a long-winded preacher. Paul preaches well into the midnight hour, so it's really late. Let's go easy on the kid Eutychus because of the long preacher. He nods during the preaching, falls out of a window, dies. Paul prays, resurrects him, and then this is classic. They eat more and Paul preaches more. That's amazing to me. I love that Eutychus wasn't chastised for sleeping during the Apostle Paul's sermon, and I love the resurrection moment after he dies. Do you know what this tells me? If you put yourself in the right place, even with the wrong disposition, you're going to get something valuable even if you fall asleep. Even if you come to church on Sunday nodding, still come. You're going to get something. It could even be a resurrection moment. Everything worked against poor Eutychus. The preacher's long. It's in the middle of the night. You just ate. You're sitting on a windowsill. This is an accident waiting to happen. You could say the same thing with updated language. The kids were up late. I had to work Saturday. I'm exhausted. The weather is horrible outside. God still has something for you, even if you're nodding in church. Show up tired. Just show up. And I really believe God will show up like he did in this chapter. Thanks for joining the 260 Journey.